Today's recipe calls for basil. I'm going to show you how to make a super simple pasta sauce, also known as basil pesto. So with that said, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is measure out 2/3 cup or 157 mils of a good tasting olive oil. You don't want to use an olive oil that's too strong in flavor and taste. This way it doesn't overpower the rest of the ingredients. Now that we have our oil measured out, we're going to throw it in the fridge, and I'll explain why we're doing this later on in the video. Now that our olive oil is in the fridge box, you're going to grab a large pot and fill it up with water. You're going to throw it over high heat, and we're going to bring our water to a boil. Now that we have our pot of water boiling, you're going to grab yourself a large bushel of basil, and you're going to start to pick it. You want to ensure that you don't get any of the stems with your basil leaves. The stems are super woody and bitter in taste. In the end, you should have 2.5 ounces or 70 grams worth of basil. It's roughly 2 cups of packed basil. You're better off weighing it out, because if you start to pack your basil leaves in a cup, it'll bruise it and turn it dark. Now that our pot of water has come to a boil, we're going to start to blanch all of our basil leaves. You can totally skip this step if you want. Blanching your basil leaves will lock in that green color. You're going to blanch your leaves for about 30 to 40 seconds. Now that the seconds have gone by, you're going to pull your basil leaves out of your pot. You're going to shake off as much excess water as possible and throw it into a bowl with ice water. You're going to throw it in the ice bath to stop the cooking process, and you want to ensure that you completely submerge all of your basil leaves in the ice bath. Repeat the same process for the rest of your basil. Now that your basil has been blanched, shocked, and chilled, you're going to throw it on a half sheet tray that has been lined with towels and paper towels. This way it'll soak up any of the excess water. And you don't want your basil leaves chilling in the ice bath for too long. This way it doesn't soak up any excess water. When you're pulling your basil leaves out of the water, you want to give it a real good squeeze and wring out as much water as possible. When you're throwing it on your half sheet tray, you want to break it up. This way as much of your basil as possible is exposed to the air. This way it dries out a lot quicker. You'll notice when you're wringing your basil out, when we first started, we ended up with 2 large handfuls of basil leaves. Now that we've blanched it, it's lost a ton of volume, and we're left with about 1/4 cup or so of basil, which is totally normal and fine. Now that you've given your basil leaves the old squeezer and wrung out as much water as possible, you're going to grab another set of paper towels to throw on top, and you're going to lightly press on your leaves to extract even more water. Once you've done this, you're going to set them aside and let them dry out in room temperature weather, and we're going to move on to the next step. The next thing we're going to do is grab a small saute pan and throw it over low heat. Into our pan, we're going to add 1/4 cup or 70 grams worth of pine nuts. We're going to dry toast our pine nuts until they become nice and golden brown in color. You can totally skip this step if you choose. Dry toasting our pine nuts will help extract some of the natural oils that they hold, and it'll make our pine nuts even more nutty and giving our basil pesto even more flavor. You want to do this process in a low and slow environment, because pine nuts are super expensive and you don't want to burn them. In the end, this is what your pine nuts should look like, nice and golden brown. You're going to grab yourself a holding apparatus and set those aside and let them completely cool down before we start to make our pesto. The last and final thing we need to measure out is our cheese. A traditional basil pesto calls for Parmesan Reggiano and a Pecorino cheese, but my allowance isn't that much, so I had to go with 1 cheese, and I'm using Parmesan Reggiano. You can use both cheeses, whatever you decide to use. Ensure that you use freshly grated cheese, not that pre-grated nonsense that has a coating on it that prevents it from sticking. That stuff is gross, and we don't want to use that. You're going to measure out a heaping half cup of cheese or 12 grams worth. Now that we have everything measured out, you're going to grab a food processor and you're going to throw in 3 large garlic cloves with a few pinches of kosher salt. The next thing you're going to add to your food processor is your toasted pine nuts. We're going to blitz all of this together until we get a nice paste of pine nuts and garlic. And there's a total method to the madness when making pesto, so it's best to follow these steps in order. And you may have to stop your food processor to scrape down the sides of your bowl to ensure everything gets nice and well mixed throughout this process. Now that we have the paste formed in our food processor, we're going to grab our chilled olive oil out of the fridge, and we're going to add a small driblet of oil to our food processor. This way it'll help lubricate everything. After you've added that small blip of oil, you're going to throw all of your blanched basil into your food processor. Once you have all of your basil added to your food processor, you're going to add another small drip of oil again. This way it speeds up the process of everything coming together. Once you have everything in, throw the lid on and start to blitz everything together. While it's blending, you're going to slowly pour in your chilled olive oil. The reason why we're using a chilled olive oil is because the food processor is going to generate heat, which in turn will cook our basil leaves, which will turn them dark in color, and we want that bright green pesto. So to counterbalance the heat from the processor, we're using the chilled olive oil. The last thing we're going to add is our cheese. We're going to give it a quick mix until it's nice and well incorporated, and adding the cheese at the very end prevent it from becoming too milty from the heat of our processor. Now that we have everything nice and well incorporated, in the end, this is what your pesto should look like. You're going to give it a quick taste and adjust the seasoning as needed with a few pinches of kosher salt, and this is totally optional, but we're going to add a few squeezes of fresh lemon juice. Now that your pesto is done, grab your favorite holding apparatus and throw it in that. And a few ways to store your basil pesto in the fridge, prevent it from oxidizing. You can throw some extra olive oil on the top. This way the air doesn't get to it and it doesn't oxidize. Or you can grab some saran wrap and adhere it to your pesto. This way the air doesn't get to it as well. Now that it's done, grab your favorite box of pasta or make some homemade fresh pasta, or even grab some bread to dip it in. Whatever you decide to do, just enjoy. Alright, now that our basil pesto is done, let's give it the old taster-oo. So looking at it, it's nice and bright green, it's super vibrant in color, looks really tasty. The only thing is I may have added just a touch too much oil, so it's a bit thin, but it's not really that big of a deal. It'll work the same, and it comes down to personal preference. You can add less oil to make it a little bit more chunky, or add even more oil to thin it out. It's really up to you. Let's give it a shot though. Our basil pesto came out super tasty. The first flavor I get is garlic. It's nice and garlicky and really tasty because garlic is just super good, of course. Then the next flavor I get is a bit of nuttiness from the toasted pine nuts and a little bit of nuttiness from our cheese as well. Then of course the cheese adds that cheesy, delicious flavor too. Then we get a bit of saltiness from that as well. Then that fresh basil is just nice and fresh and robust in flavor. Then that olive oil adds a ton of fat and richness and gives it the perfect mouthfeel. Then the splash of lemon juice that we added adds a ton of acid and really brightens up the pesto and cuts through all that rich fatty from our olive oil. Overall, this stuff is just super tasty. Alright, that's it for today's video. This recipe is really easy. There's not a whole lot to it. You can use this basil pesto to make whatever you want. Maybe like a lemon basil chicken breast, or throw it on some salmon, or better yet, make some homemade fresh pasta and toss it in this pesto, which sounds super tasty right now. And once you learn the basics on how to make a pesto, you can have so many different variations of this. Maybe use different greens like some carrot tops or spinach, and sub out different nuts like walnuts or sunflower seeds or even almonds. And I've even made a broccoli pesto, which was super tasty. So there's endless opportunities out there to make a pesto and what to use it for. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching. And I gotta go make sure I don't have any of this green schmutz in my teeth before I leave the house. So we'll see you on the next one. So right off the bat, and it comes down to personal preference. I can't. Garlic, it's nice and garlicky and pop and fresh and pop pop pop. There's endless opportunities, and once you learn the fundamentals,